You're listening to the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. Hi everyone and welcome back to another episode of the Dibbly Dobbly Podcast. On the podcast we have started a historical series looking back at the game of cricket's history. For today's historical series episode, we are looking back at the history of Adelaide Oval. The Adelaide Oval is one of world cricket's great venues with its iconic scoreboard and hill. It has a long history and association with the game of cricket in South Australia, but also in Australia. Joining me to discuss and talk about the history of Adelaide Oval is Trevor Manuel. He was an ambassador and tour guide at Adelaide Oval. Trevor, welcome.
Thank you.
It's great to have you here, Trevor, and I hope we're going to have a great chat about the history, the long, illustrious history of Adelaide Oval and its association with cricket, because it has played a big part in Australian cricket history over the years. It's witnessed many great things, and it's such an iconic ground in the Australian calendar when it comes to cricket. So I hope everyone watching, listening today would learn a lot from Trevor and learn a lot about the history of Adelaide Oval. So, Trevor, to start this discussion off, let's talk about the origins of Adelaide Oval. Now, Trevor, tell us how Adelaide Oval was established. Who was the person or persons responsible for the formation of the Adelaide Oval?
Well, this could be a fairly lengthy answer, but if we go back about, let's say, 30,000 years, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plain, the Aboriginal people of the Adelaide Plain, actually had campsites along the River Torrens, which is about, it's less than 100 metres from the gates of Adelaide Oval. And we know from their stories and from research that they used the area where the Adelaide Oval is, particularly the men, for social and cultural gatherings. They had ceremonies, they had meetings, they had activities there, even games and sports. So if you look at the way the Adelaide Oval is used today as a multi-purpose venue, it actually reflects how the Kaurna people had used the area for the last 30,000 years. So we could say that Adelaide Oval's been there for 30,000 years. But if we get to post-European settlement in South Australia, there was a group called the South Australian Cricketing Association, a cricketing club, that took out a peppercorn lease on the area where the Oval is, about 6 acres, and their aim was to set up an oval and play cricket. Well, they managed to get some grass there, and they didn't know too much about pitch construction, so they called on a guy by the name of John Cocker. Now, John Cocker was an English migrant. He actually set up a hotel in North Adelaide, the Kentish Arms Hotel, and he was a bit of a cricket superstar in Adelaide because he played one game of county cricket for Kent in his early days, and that sort of set him up as an important person. And outside the hotel, there was a road called Man Terrace, which is still there. But in those days, it was a wide, flat roadway. And he used to spend more time out there playing cricket if he could get someone to play with than he did actually in his hotel. So he was asked to establish the first pitch in the area where Adelaide Oval is now. And because he did that, the locals called it Johnny Cocker's Cricket Ground for a number of years. That was in the mid-1860s. And then probably the father of the Adelaide Oval is a pioneer businessman called Henry Sparks. He had a vision that Adelaide would have a centralised cricket ground in the manner that the sister colonies had, like Melbourne and Sydney. And so he took it upon himself to go to Melbourne and chat with the people at the Melbourne Cricket Club about how they'd establish their ground. And he talked about grass and fencing and pitch construction, all that sort of thing. And he determined it would cost about £200 in those days to establish the cricket ground. So he came back to Adelaide. He didn't get a lot of support, but through subscriptions, he managed to raise £150. And then some cricketers put on a play and managed to get the other £50. So he got his £200, and all the while that was going on, there started to be some rumblings about we need a cricket ground here in Adelaide. Some prominent cricketers and business people wrote to the editor in the paper under interesting pseudonyms like Long On and Short Leg, and proposed that we needed a cricket ground. So in May 1871, a meeting was called of interested parties in a hotel in Adelaide. About 60 people showed up, and the South Australian Cricket Association was formed, or it was called the South Australian Cricketing Association in those days. And its first president was actually the governor of South Australia. And after their first meeting, they decided they had two aims. One aim was to establish a central cricket ground, and the other aim was to arrange intercolonial matches with presumably Victoria and New South Wales. So that was their aim. That was May 1871. Because where the Oval is in the parklands, a bill had to be presented through Parliament to allow the Adelaide City Council to lease the area to the Cricketing Association, because they wanted 12 acres, and that was a fair slice of the northern parklands. That went through. So they got their hands on the area, and they'd taken over the lease, or the peppercorn rent that the previous South Australian Cricket Club had on it. They negotiated with the council over a lease. The Cricketing Association wanted a very low lease, of course. They eventually agreed, took about 12 months, but they eventually agreed on £7 a year for the first 4 years, and then £14 a year after that for the life of the lease, which in the first case was 21 years. So that gave them the right to establish the Oval there. There was a few restrictions on that lease, though. They were only allowed to play cricket on the ground, and if they wanted to do anything else, they had to then go back to the Adelaide Council and say, is it all right if we do this or we do that? And can we charge for them to get in? So it sort of hamstrung what went on at the Oval. They could play cricket there, but that was about all initially. And it was several years before anything else arrived at Adelaide Oval. But that was the origins of the Oval itself.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to listen to that, how the Adelaide Oval came to be. But I'm guessing back then cricket was the main sport in Adelaide at the time, and the Oval helped South Australia in that regard. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it was the first probably organised sport, although athletics had been going for quite a while, and they were very interested in using the Oval, but under the lease arrangements, they weren't allowed to initially.
Yeah, some strict restrictions there in the early years, of course. So, Trevor, what were the first ever matches of cricket to be played at the Adelaide Oval in terms of test matches, Sheffield Shield cricket, or other organised cricket in those days?
Well, prior to them playing a match there, they actually had to establish some grass and create a pitch, and that caused all sorts of problems, because in Adelaide's hot, dry summers, they had trouble getting either ryegrass or couch grass to grow. And it was December 1873 before they had it ready for cricket. And in the period leading up to that, they'd tried different grasses. They didn't have water. They had to carry it in buckets from the River Torrens if they wanted to water anything. And just when they had an oval prepared, the locusts came through and ate it all out. But by December 1873, the members played a game on the Oval. It wasn't an official game. It was just sort of an in-house opening. So the first official game that was played at Adelaide Oval was in March 1874, when a touring team led by W.G. Grace arrived in Adelaide, and they played a 3-day game against South Australia. And because it was the beginnings of South Australian cricket, really, and we weren't particularly good, and W.G. was feeling fairly generous, we were allowed to have 22 players to his 11. So we had 22 fieldsmen, 22 batsmen, and the choice of 22 bowlers. It didn't make a lot of difference to the result. Our 22 batsmen made 63 runs in the first innings, and 12 of them made ducks. And England used 2 bowlers to get them all out. One, I think, took 13 wickets and the other one 8. So it wasn't a great start to cricket in South Australia, but that was the beginnings. In November of that year, we had an intercolonial match, played Victoria at Adelaide Oval. By then, we were down to 18 players. So, it was getting closer to even. But again, we weren't a great lot of competition for Victoria in that match. In terms of, I guess, official games, our first test match was played at Adelaide Oval in 1884. Australia had toured England earlier in the year, in the winter, And then the two teams came back to Australia. In fact, England arrived 3 weeks before the Australian team did, and the first test was set for Adelaide. And I guess the lead up to the test was probably even more interesting than the game itself. When they arrived in Adelaide, it turned out that the Australians didn't want to play for the money that was being offered, because in those days, it wasn't boards organising cricket tours. It was sponsors or benefactors who set up the tour as a money-making arrangement. Well, the Australian cricketers didn't want what they were offered. And eventually, to get the game to go ahead, the Secretary of the Cricket Association, John Cresswell, had to offer each team an additional £450 just to play the game. Well, that won them over, and they played the test in Adelaide. The captain of Australia, Billy Murdoch, I don't think he was too interested in the game because he got married 3 days earlier. So there'd been very little practice going on by the Australians. George Giffen, the South Australian, he'd practiced because he wanted to make a good impression on his local crowd. Cresswell, the secretary, managed to get the government offices and many of the businesses in Adelaide to close for half a day on day one so that he'd get a crowd at the game. And again, like the other first games we had at Adelaide Oval, we didn't perform all that well, and England won the test quite comfortably. But it was the lead up to the test that was the interesting part rather than the game itself. And it was only 5 months after the first test had been played at Lord's. So it's another link between Adelaide and Lord's, really.
Yes. Actually, it was the Oval that hosted the first test match in England when test cricket started in England. And then Lord's got it 4 years later in 1884. So there's a connection there between Adelaide Oval and Lord's. Lord's played its first test in 1884, same with the Adelaide Oval, Australia and England. How fitting is that? And obviously there was only a few years before that infamous test match at the Oval in 1882, which gave birth to the Ashes legend.
Yes.
But the Ashes weren't really in existence, really. They didn't really exist in those days, because the term wasn't really used until the 1900s, and we've used it.
Adelaide called the grand cricket match. They weren't using the term test cricket in those days either.
Yes, so test cricket was definitely different in those early days, and it's over 146 years old, so it's still going strong.
Yep.
And it's always great to watch a test match at Adelaide Oval. Even the ground has undergone some redevelopments over the years. It's not quite the same as it was back in 1800s to now. It's quite very different. So yeah, it's changed a lot throughout the different eras and generations, hasn't it, Trevor? The Adelaide Oval.
Yes, it's as it is now. It used to be an incredibly long ground because it was basically just a paddock with a fence around it initially. At one stage, the oval was nearly 200 metres long, which made it very tough for fielders if the ball got hit back past the bowler and someone had to chase it to long on. Now it's about 168 metres long, about 130 metres wide, but at least these days it's an oval shape, not like it was for 100 years with that straight boundary on the western side, or a very short boundary on that western side, which really gave it a D-shaped look that was straight on one side and curved around the rest. And that shape was actually as a result of the cycling track that was around Adelaide Oval for about 30 years. The finishing straight was down the western side in front of the grandstands, and when it was eventually removed, we were still stuck with that straight side. So that created the shape of the oval for quite a while.
Yeah, that's quite interesting to hear that. And you hear a lot of players when they go to Adelaide Oval and play, you always get good value for shots down the ground because you can run a lot of all-run fours or even the odd five on odd occasions because it's such a long, straight boundary down the ground, but quite short square of the wicket. So if you bowl a bit short as a bowler, an outside off stump, you get a bit, and the batter cuts you for four. You get valuable shots there as well. So it's definitely a wonderful ground to play cricket, and a lot of the players say that as well, even in international touring sides and Australian players and even interstate players for Sheffield Shield cricket. They even say the same thing. It's a wonderful place to play cricket, the Adelaide Oval. So Trevor, Were there other sports to be played at Adelaide Oval other than cricket? Now, for our Australian viewers and listeners, you would know that Australian rules football, AFL. For those who may not know what AFL is, it's pretty much like rugby on steroids. That's what it is. That's played at Adelaide Oval, so everyone knows that. But have there been other sports other than cricket, AFL football, etc., that have been played at Adelaide Oval over the years?
Yes. Once the Cricket Association could work their way around the contract with the Adelaide Council, the first other sport that appeared at Adelaide Oval was in 1885. They played, or they had an athletics carnival there, and athletics used the Oval after that for annual carnivals for quite a few years. 1887 was when football began at Adelaide Oval. Australian rules football began at Adelaide Oval. And probably one of the strangest sports we've had at Adelaide Oval was in 1884, we played a season of quoits. And probably what's even more surprising is that people actually paid to go in and watch other people play quoits on Adelaide Oval. And since then, there's been about 20 major sports that have been played at the ground at various times, things like lacrosse, hockey, baseball, just about name it. And there's been some sort of high-level sport played at Adelaide Oval because it's the one major ground in Adelaide.
Yeah, absolutely. And even rugby as well, soccer, football as well have been played at the ground. So it's a multi-purpose stadium. Yeah, Adelaide Oval. It's not one-dimensional as it was, as you mentioned earlier, in the early years when it was only cricket meant to be played at the ground. It's like Lords in a way, if we can go back to the connection with Lords. When I chatted to Neil Robinson from Lords and MCC, head of Heritage and Collections, he said the same thing. Lords had a game of baseball played at the ground as well, a bit of hockey. And it even had the archery for the Olympics in 2012 as well. So even Lords is a multi-purpose ground as it was, but it is the home of cricket, and it's primarily known for cricket than other sports. But that's quite interesting. And I guess that's the same in other sporting stadiums around Australia as well, not just the Adelaide Oval, that other sports were played at the ground in its early formative years. Isn't that right, Trevor?
Yes. Yeah. Most of the grounds in Australia have doubled up, particularly in the southern states, with Australian rules football and cricket, and then other events as they've come up.
Yeah. Trevor, before we move on to our next topic, what other historical features does Adelaide Oval have that people may not be aware of, besides the scoreboard and the hill? Back in the old days, when the Adelaide Oval was just forming as a ground, were there any other features that were there that are not there now, or are still there in some sort of shape or form?
Okay, well, on the back of the northern mound, we've got our Moreton Bay fig trees. They were planted in 1890, and they're the oldest remaining thing at Adelaide Oval now. But most people think they were probably planted so that people sitting on the mound had a bit of shade to sit under, but that's not quite the reason. Back in the 1880s and 1890s, Adelaide Oval was a real multi-purpose venue. Over summer, they had all sorts of events and carnivals and activities on the ground. And over the Christmas holiday period, people used to flock to Adelaide Oval. At one stage, where the riverbank stand now is, there was a roller coaster, and people would come in the evening and ride on the roller coaster. But whenever there was an event at Adelaide Oval, a lot of people used to sit on the hill towards the north of Adelaide Oval, behind the Oval, called Montefiore Hill, and they could watch what was going on the Oval free of charge. And the Cricketing Association didn't like that very much, and they thought they had to block the view. And rather than put up a big ugly fence, they decided to plant the Moreton Bay fig trees. And it did take the trees 30 years to grow high enough to block the view. But 130 odd years later, they're now part of the fabric of Adelaide Oval, the Moreton Bay fig trees. So that's one of the existing older things at Adelaide Oval that's still there. Probably the other one was the cycling track that I mentioned. Cycling track was put in around 1885, and cycling in the late 1890s, very early 1900s was a very big sport in Australia. and it attracted world champions from the US would come out and race there. And Adelaide Oval was seen as a very good, fast track. It eventually became a bitumen track, banked at the ends and quite wide. And some of the old photos, you can see the development of the track from the 1880s through the 1890s. By 1911, the sport had sort of waned. The track was still there. Eventually, it was taken out, and it's now about where about the first 4 or 5 rows of seating are around the boundary at Adelaide Oval. But that was another thing from the past that now doesn't exist, but did have a big effect on the oval itself.
Yes, I didn't know that as well, that it used to have a cycling track there at Adelaide Oval.
One of the things that actually did get used for a first for Adelaide Oval in 1902, Adelaide Oval hosted the first motor race anywhere in Australia. Now, all the motor enthusiasts shouldn't get all excited about Formula One or supercars or anything like that. The vehicles were actually motorised bicycles, and they raced on the cycling track. But it was it's been acknowledged as the first motor race in Australia. They did have a parade of motor vehicles, of cars, of about 6 cars that went round the cycling track, but the whole race was motorised bicycles.
Wow. Well, you learn something new every day. So Adelaide Oval used to have motorised bicycle races back in the 1900s, which is fascinating. So that was good to hear about the origins of Adelaide Oval, Trevor, and how it became to be what it is today. Let's move on to our next topic and talk about the iconic scoreboard, of course, at Adelaide Oval, which is one of cricket's most iconic landmarks. It's the first thing people talk about when they're referring to Adelaide Oval. They talk about the scoreboard, they talk about the hill. But Trevor, not too many cricket grounds still have old historic buildings connecting to their past. Some that come to mind is Lord's, the Pavilion, the SCG with the members and ladies stands, the Oval in England with its pavilion, and same with Old Trafford and Trent Bridge with their pavilions as well. But if the scoreboard could talk at Adelaide Oval, would have endless tales to tell, really. It's witnessed so many of the historical moments in Australian cricket, but also in world cricket. Some of the games, great players have had their names on that scoreboard. And the Adelaide Oval scoreboard is very unique. There is no other scoreboard in world cricket like it in the world, really. It's one of a kind, which makes it so special. So, Trevor, tell us the history associated with the scoreboard. What year was it constructed? Who was the architect who designed the scoreboard? And how does the thing work?
Well, the scoreboard was built in 1911. It was the third scoreboard at the Oval. Well, fourth if you count one that was built, taken down, then rebuilt. But 1911 was the Oval scoreboard. The architect was an Adelaide architect called Kenneth Milne, and he's known for building some of the designing some of the interesting buildings around Adelaide that still exist. He got paid £70 for his design. He actually went over to Melbourne and had a look at the scoreboard in Melbourne before coming back and designing the Adelaide Oval one. And when it came time to build it, there was a bit of a dispute between Kenneth and the Cricketing Association. They actually wanted it built on a mound in the other corner of the Oval. He wanted it built where it currently is, and the way to convince the Cricket Association to build it where it was to give them 2 quotes. And the quote to build it in the other location was a whole lot dearer than the quote to build it where it eventually got built. So the Cricket Association went for the cheaper quote, and it's where it is, and it's been there for well over 100 years, and we think we know that the architect got it right. It cost about £1,425 to build in 1911, and that's about the same price as what a 3-bedroom house in Adelaide would have been at that time. So the bottom floor is a bar, and that's always been there. And then above that, there are 4 levels across which the operators work, particularly during cricket matches. We do use it for all sports that are played at Adelaide Oval. So some of the sports like football, where the score doesn't change as often. You don't need as many to operate. You don't have the names up there and all that sort of thing. So for football or soccer, it only takes 2 people to operate it. But for cricket, it's 4 for a Sheffield Shield match, 5 for a Test match, and it takes 7 people when there's a T20, when the Big Bash is on, just because things happen so quickly. And they're working across all 4 levels inside the scoreboard. It's a mechanically operated scoreboard, or it was in 1911, and it still is. We haven't changed the operation of it much at all. All the numbers that you see turning around are on rollers, and they're turned either by a handle, or in the case of the total score of the team that's batting, once they get past 99, you actually have to open a little door, pick up a number 1 and slide it into the slot. So you don't get a handle to turn with that. The nameplates are all made for each match. So they're individual letters, a bit like an old Scrabble board. You've got to actually put the letters into it. The nameplates will take between 10 and 12 letters, depending on how big they are, whether they're I's or whether they're W's. So when you have a hyphenated name or a really long name, the operators have to get creative about how they put the name up. One that's currently causes them a bit of trouble is Labuschagne, because you can't fit the whole word on. So I think at the moment he's Lab apostrophe Shane to get it all in. And that happens quite frequently with hyphenated names or really long names. They have to adapt to get them all on there. And that's about a 2-hour job to make up the 2 sets of names for a cricket match.
Yeah, 22 players in total, so that takes a very long time.
Yeah. The one modern addition to the scoreboard is the lights that you see when a fielder fields the ball. By modern addition, they were added in 1928. We actually got the idea from the Sydney Cricket Ground. Our cricket team was playing over there, saw they had lights on their scoreboard, brought the idea back to Adelaide, and convinced the scoreboard operators to punch some holes in the front of the scoreboard and poke some lights through. They're a bit more secure now and a bit safer, but they're still there, and that's about the only major change to the scoreboard since it's been built, or from what Kenneth Mill designed.
Yes, and it's heritage listed, of course, so nothing can be altered or changed, and it has to remain where it is to this day because it's heritage listed along with the Moreton Bay Figs. Isn't that right, Trevor?
Partly. The heritage listing means that it can't be demolished or it can't be substantially altered, but it doesn't mean it can't be moved. And there was some talk when the redevelopment took place at Adelaide Oval about moving it out to the number 2 grounds, and people weren't sure that it would fit the new ground. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I should say, they didn't get their way, and we've still got it in its location, and it'll probably remain there. The Moreton Bay Figs aren't heritage listed, but they are covered by quite a lot of documentation about care and how they should be looked after. They're pretty safe, I think. I don't think they're going anywhere.
No, it adds to the ground, of course.
Yes, yeah.
And you spoke about players with long names. Ian Chappell, quite interesting story about his nickname, Chappelli. You couldn't fit his full name on the scoreboard, so they just put Chappelli on the scoreboard, and people called Ian Chappell Chappelli after that because of his name on the scoreboard. It
was when Greg Chappell first came into the team, and they
that's right.
had the tradition then of just using surnames, and they had to differentiate between the two of them. So it went up as Chappell G and Chappell I, and Australians, being what they are, looked at Chappell I, and it just became Chappelli.
Yeah, quite an interesting story there that he tells about that. Ian Chappell, one of South Australia's great players, and we'll talk about that in a minute about the history of South Australian cricket. But the last question before we move on to the next topic, Trevor, has the scoreboard undergone any restoration work? Does it undertake any restoration work on a regular basis? Does it get maintained?
Well, it is pretty much in original condition. In the early 2000s, it did develop a little bit of a lean, and that was probably due to the way the mounds were constructed in the early days. They were just sort of soil piled on top of soil, and the foundations of the scoreboard moved slightly. So it has had reinforcing rods put through it just to stabilise it. Other than that, it's pretty much in original condition.
Well, that's fantastic. And hopefully we'll stay there for many, many years to come. It's over 100 years old since 1911. So hopefully we'll stay for another 100 or so years for people to enjoy and marvel at every time they go to Adelaide Oval. And especially you get that on the tours, I'm guessing, Trevor.
Yes, when we take people inside the scoreboard and show them how it works.
Yes, they must marvel at how you can operate this such big structure.
It's really a highlight for most people on the tour. It's the wow factor.
Yes, especially with the cricket tragics, maybe. Probably it's an iconic thing in world cricket. So, you got to tick that off the list. You've got to go to Adelaide Oval, got to have a look at the scoreboard. But it was great to hear about the scoreboard's history and how it all works, and it's quite interesting. Trevor, for our next topic, let's talk about the history of South Australian cricket, the SACA, or the South Australian Cricket Association, and its history with Adelaide Oval and within the game of cricket within Australia. Now, I think you mentioned it earlier that the SACA was formed in 1871, and it's one of the oldest cricket associations and teams in Australia, because New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia were the first three teams to play in the Sheffield Shield since the Sheffield Shield commenced in 1892-93. And they were the first three teams that played for the first few Sheffield Shield competitions until Queensland was introduced in the 1920s, then followed by WA, and then obviously Tasmania is the latest inclusion in the 1970s. Yes. So that's how the Sheffield Shield has developed over the years. But Trevor, just tell us a bit about South Australia as a cricket team in terms of its early years in Sheffield Shield cricket. South Australia has won quite a lot of Sheffield Shields, not many as New South Wales, who's got the record with 40 plus, especially when you have the test side. Of course, they're going to win every title, and obviously Victoria have done pretty well over the years. But South Australia, just talk us through about, our early years in the Sheffield Shield. Did we win many? Did we lose? Talk about how South Australia became the cricket team it is today.
Okay, well, the Sheffield Shield came about after Lord Sheffield brought it to Australia, and we had no competition in those days in the early 1890s, and he donated £150 to promote intercolonial cricket, and that was used to most of it, I guess, to make the Sheffield Shield trophy, because there's 5.5 kilograms of silver in it, and the rest was used to set up the matches between New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia. And the very first Sheffield Shield match was at Adelaide Oval, and South Australia played New South Wales at the ground, and that's one of the matches we won. And there was no trophy for that game because the Shield hadn't been completed yet, the manufacture of it. So the umpires actually knocked up a little trophy themselves that they called the Lord Sheffield Trophy, which we have on display at Adelaide Oval. And it's basically a little block of wood with the ball from the match attached to the top of it. But that was the original trophy for the Sheffield Shield, if you like, before the Shield itself was made. Victoria won the first Sheffield Shield, and the following season, South Australia was successful. So the second season of Sheffield Shield cricket, South Australia won. By that time, the Shield had actually been made. So South Australia prides itself in being the first colony to be actually presented with the Sheffield Shield. We do have a room at Adelaide Oval called the Sheffield Shield Room, which is the history of South Australian cricket. And South Australia is the custodian of the Sheffield Shield. So it stays in the Sheffield Shield Room during the cricket season, and then at the end of the season, it goes to whichever state now wins it. And then before the next season, it comes back to South Australia, and we look after it during the cricket season. Seeing we haven't won it very much in the last, 25 years, it's nice to see it there sometimes.
Yes, it is. And as we recording this episode, of course, the Sheffield Shield final
Hmm.
is happening at the moment between Western Australia and Victoria.
Yes.
Quite interesting to hear about that, of course. Hopefully South Australia can win a Sheffield Shield soon. It's been since the 90s that we won the Shield last. But South Australia has done okay over the years in Sheffield Shield cricket.
There's probably two golden periods of South Australian cricket. One was in the very early 1900s when we had a very good team. At times there were four of them and I think at one stage there might have even been five in the Test side. And then, of course, in the Bradman years, while he was in South Australia, there was two Sheffield Shields under his captaincy. So that was pretty handy too.
Well, yes, it's quite handy when you have one of the world's best batters in the game, captaining and leading South Australia to Sheffield Shield victories. Trevor, the role of South Australian cricket, the SACA plays in cricket in South Australia has changed over the years since the association was formed in the formative years. So what sort of a contribution is SACA making to cricket in South Australia today, Trevor, in terms of promoting the game and making sure that cricket's strong in South Australia?
Well, I guess in terms of improving South Australian cricket, which is the aim to improve all levels of cricket, but particularly the top level, the interstate cricket, there's been a number of reviews in the last couple of years, and what's been found is that the gap between district cricket, first-class cricket and Test cricket have widened in South Australia, and it's more difficult to get people flowing through those various levels, and that's probably led to South Australia not being as strong as it could have been. One of the factors that's been suggested is the number of district teams we have. Maybe we have too many, and the standard's not quite as great. So SACA's looking at addressing those sorts of issues, and they've certainly expanded in what they do to taking grassroots cricket and certainly women's cricket these days. So it's a lot wider brief than it was in the 1890s.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully we can, as we mentioned before, hopefully South Australia can get back to winning ways and start dominating the Shield as it did in the early years when the Shield came about in those early competitions.
Well, now that we've got a couple of regular Test players, particularly in men's side with Head and Carey, that gives a bit of a focus to cricket in South Australia now, whereas for many years we were struggling to get any representation at the top level, and representation at that level's worth its weight in gold as far as kids and development and those sorts of things.
Absolutely, and they're doing a good job, Travis Head and Alex Carey, and hopefully they have more success with the Australian team and keep representing South Australia. And that leads on to my next point, Trevor, and you touched on it there. South Australia's international players that have played for Australia in both men's and women's cricket. And just to name a few, there's been so many that have played. Just to name a few from the women's game, we've got Karen Rolton, Shelley Nishke, who's the current Australian women's coach, Joanne Broadbent, Faith Thomas, who was the first Indigenous female or male cricketer to play for Australia.
Yes.
Megan Schutt, Talia McGrath, Amanda Jade Wellington, Darcy Brown, who's bowling quick and coming through in the Australian women's team, and she's doing great. In the men's side, we have George Giffen, as we mentioned, Joe Darling. Interesting fact about Joe Darling, hit the first actual six in Test cricket, which was at the Adelaide Oval. Ernest Jones, Clem Hill, Clary Grimmett, the famous leg spinner, probably the Shane Warne of his day. Sir Don Bradman, of course, the Chappell brothers, Jason Gillespie, Greg Blewett, Darren Lehman, Tim May, and obviously, as we mentioned, Travis Head and Alex Carey, and Victor Richardson, who was the grandfather of the Chappell brothers. He was a very good sportsman himself and very good cricketer for Australia. South Australia.
You'd have a good team if you had them all around at the same time, wouldn't you?
That's a pretty good team that I've just read out in both men's and women's cricket. They're pretty good players in both. If you had to field both teams for a men's or a women's game, they're going to be pretty hard to beat as a South Australian unit, I think. But some good players there. There's so many to list, as I mentioned. I've missed out a few there, but just to name a few. So, Trevor, tell us, how many players from South Australia have represented Australia in both women's and men's cricket? And tell us a bit about some of the players I just mentioned in that list of players that have gone on from South Australia to play for Australia in women's and men's cricket.
Okay, we've had about 650 first-class men's players in South Australia over the years, and of those, about 55 have represented Australia in Test cricket. In the women's cricket, I believe it's around about 10 of the women have represented Australia. Perhaps one of the women that you didn't mention was Lynn Fulston. Now, Lynn was an international cricketer. She also played international netball for Australia in the 1980s. And when she retired, she turned into a brilliant coach and mentor of particularly women's sport. Unfortunately, she died quite early, age 52. And there's an area at the Adelaide Oval that we call the Lynn Fulston Lawns to honour her. And when it was dedicated in 2013, it was the first area in a major sports ground in Australia that was dedicated to a woman. So that was a rare honour for Lynn. In terms of the men, it was certainly a golden era in the days of Giffen. Another one in there was Ernie Jones, the fast bowler from the late 1890s. And then you mentioned Joe Darling and the six. Clem Hill was another one from about the same era. And in that time of those four, three ended up as captains of Australia. So we certainly were pulling our weight then. I guess Clem Hill's greatest claim to fame is 3 innings that he played, 1 in Melbourne and then 2 in Adelaide, where he was dismissed for 99, then 98, and then 97 in 3 successive innings. So I don't think that's a record that's going to change much.
No, I don't. I don't think so. He's got a statue at the Adelaide Oval, Clem Hill. So there's been a lot of great players that have played the South Australian women's and men's cricket, of course. And hopefully we have many more in the years to come representing Australia. Let's talk about the overseas players to play for South Australia, Trevor. That we've seen some of the world's best players come and play Sheffield Shield cricket for South Australia over the years. So, Trevor, tell us about some of the overseas players that have come and played for South Australia over the years that people may not know that they actually came to South Australia, played a few games or a season of Sheffield Shield cricket for South Australia.
Well, the very first international we had was way back in about 1910, I think he came out. His name was Jack Crawford, and he was an Englishman, played for Surrey, and he actually played 12 tests for England, had a bit of a dispute with Surrey over selection, and found himself in Australia and in South Australia. So he started playing for South Australia, and he was playing at about the time that the Scoreboard was built. And when the Scoreboard was built, SACA decided to have a prize for the first player to have 100 posted on the scoreboard, first-class player, and the first-class player to take 5 wickets. Well, in the very first match against Victoria, Jack Crawford made 112, so he got the prize for the batting. In the next match that was played at Adelaide Oval, he took a fifer, or he actually took 6 wickets. So he got the prize for the bowling as well. He played 3 or 4 seasons in South Australia. He had a bit of a dispute with SACA over wages and payment. Ended up in New Zealand. Played there for a while until he had a dispute there over wages, and eventually went back to Surrey and finished his career there. So he was the very first international that we had. And then over the years, we've had some very good ones. Names like Sir Garfield Sobers, Barry Richards, Joel Garner, Lance Gibbs, quite a few of the West Indians. And perhaps the most recent international player we've had that hasn't played first-class cricket for South Australia, but Rashid Khan, playing for the Strikers. He's galvanised such wonderful support and such interesting cricket. The sort of hero worship for Rashid Khan in South Australia is absolutely amazing. He brings thousands through the door.
Yes, he does. He's a great cricketer, Rashid Khan, and especially for the Strikers in the Big Bash.
Yes.
But some of the names you mentioned there, like Sir Garfield Sobers was arguably the greatest all-rounder that ever played the game. And he helped South Australia win a Sheffield Shield in the 60s, I believe.
Yes, some states unkindly called it the Sobers Shield because he did most of the bowling, most of the batting. But yeah, he was a brilliant cricketer for South Australia for 3 seasons. Some of the others only played 1 season or a couple, but he was certainly here for 3, and we got our money's worth from Sir Garfield Sobers as a cricketer in South Australia.
Well, it must have been interesting to hear the origins of him coming to South Australia. Maybe he just wanted to come and just play Sheffield Shield cricket in Australia, or probably he had a word with someone. I don't know.
I think he enjoyed touring here in the 61-62 series, and it was an opportunity. I'm not sure who was responsible for it, but I know Sir Donald Bradman was a great supporter or a great lover of Sir Garfield Sobers, and it wouldn't surprise if he had something to do with contacting him.
Yes, I think I heard a story with Bradman and Sobers once. I think Sobers was lying down on the massage table in the dressing room. He was asleep, and I think Bradman came in when South Australia was in trouble. He said, where's Sir Gary? Oh, he's in the dressing room having a sleep. And I think Bradman said to him, you got to get me I think Sobers tells the story. He says, he came and said, you got to give me a century today, son, because South Australia's in trouble. And he did. He would often do that, Sir Garfield Sobers.
Yeah.
You mentioned Barry Richards. He scored 300 in a day for South Australia against Western Australia in Perth. And people say that's probably the greatest innings they've ever seen. Isn't that right, Trevor?
Yes, yeah. 365, I think, he scored in the innings. And I believe in Sheffield Shield cricket, there's only him and Sir Don Bradman who have an average over 100. Of course, Barry Richards only played 8 games, so the 365 helped a lot in that. But we were lucky to see him playing at his prime.
Yes, obviously he couldn't play for South Africa, of course, due to apartheid in those days. A very gifted cricketer, along with other South African cricketers of those times, like Graham Pollock, for example, who had wonderful performances at Adelaide Oval. He would often score big runs for South Africa there. I think he scored 200 in 62, 63, I think. Yes. So Australia he was sort of like the Don Bradman of those days.
He was a bit,
Graham Pollock, and he averaged 60 plus, and very fine player, but very cut short in his career due to other reasons. But that's great to hear about the overseas players that have played for South Australia, and some of the game's great players like Sir Garfield Sobers, and those West Indian players like Joel Gardner and Lance Gibbs, off spinner from the West Indies, and he had the world record for the most Test wickets until Dennis Lilly surpassed his record and got 310.
And he's the only Test cricketer to take a hat-trick at Adelaide Oval.
Lance Gibbs?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's something new. You don't know that already, but now you know that Lance Gibbs was the only Test bowler to take a Test hat-trick at Adelaide Oval. That's quite remarkable, actually. And he was a very good bowler as well.
Yes.
For a lot of years for the West Indies. Hi, everyone. Hope you enjoyed part 1 of our historical series episode, looking back at the history of Adelaide Oval with ambassador and tour guide Trevor Manuel. I hope you enjoyed listening to Trevor and I talk about the origins of Adelaide Oval, the scoreboard, and the history of the SACA, the South Australian Cricket Association. Stay tuned for part 2 of our historical series episode, looking back at the history of Adelaide Oval with ambassador and tour guide, Trevor Manuel.